Welcome to the May 2021 installment of the Northwest China Council's China Chat series. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Liston, the president of the Northwest China Council. Helping coordinate and produce this event tonight is John Wang, executive director of the Northwest China Council. The Northwest China Council is an educational nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon, founded in 1980 from a grant from the Asia Society in New York to promote greater cultural understanding between the US and China. We offer Mandarin Chinese lessons online, China chats, and other events as well. We will likely begin in-person events in the fall as more people get vaccinated. We are looking forward to that. Stay tuned for information about those events. To learn more about our organization and to keep track of events we sponsor and are involved with, visit us on the web at nwchina.org. You can also find links to register for future China chats, and you can view recordings of previous China chats on our website or on our YouTube channel. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I wanted to let you know that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation tonight. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so by entering it in the QA function of Zoom, and I will read them to Dr. Dickson in the QA session. And after the conclusion of the event tonight, there will be a 20 to 30 minute social time, and you can find the link to that in the chat. John will put it in the chat for you. So tonight's guest is Dr. Bruce Dickson. He is a professor of political science and international affairs and the chair of the political science department at George Washington University. His research and teaching focus is on the political dynamics of China, especially the adaptability of the Chinese Communist Party and the regime it governs. His most recent book is The Party and the People, Chinese Politics in the 21st Century, which will be released on May 25th and is available for pre-order at Amazon and Powell's Books. You can find a discount code for the book in the emailed notice for this event. With that, the floor is yours. Thank you.
After being in power for over 70 years, there's no organized opposition within the country. The party's hold on power seems quite secure. And so the question is, what has allowed it to remain in power for so long? And the key to sort of understanding what keeps it in power and understanding the Chinese political system is recognizing that it is a Leninist party. And the picture on the right-hand side of the screen here has the hammer and sickle, the symbol of a communist party representing what we're seeing as a revolutionary class of workers and peasants, the sickle for the farmers, the hammer representing workers. And there's a couple of key features of what it means to be a Leninist party that's relevant for what has kept the party in power for these many years. When we think of what communism is, it's mostly thinking about Marxist ideology and the idea that abolishing private property, overthrowing capitalism, and gradually having the state wither away to a communist utopia is sort of the end goal of what communism is supposed to be about. The Chinese Communist Party largely abandoned those types of ideological goals, abolishing private property and withering away of the state. But the Leninist nature of the organization, the second part of what it means to be a communist party, remains very much relevant today. Part of that is that it remains a vanguard party. It's what led the revolution, what allowed it to win the Civil War back in 1949. One of the key elements of being a vanguard party is very selective at who it recruits in. So it's a party of over 90 million members, which seems like a lot, but China's got a lot of people. And so a little more than 6% of the party, of the population belongs to the party. And whereas the vanguard of the party before was the workers and farmers, the symbol of the flag there, today it's much more the urban educated elite. So the main source of new party members today are college students. And they joined the party not because of any particular ideological affinity. They join because they see it provides career benefits, and not just if you want to work for the party or the government, where there's a very low ceiling if you're not a party member, but even in private firms and foreign firms, party membership is seen as advantageous to getting a head start on your career. And that recognition that there's career benefits by being a party member helps create some of the popular support for the party. A second key element has to do with its relations with both the government and with society. So the Communist Party in China has a monopoly on political organization, which means there's no other opposition parties in the country. There are no legally allowed groups that form any type of political opposition, and the party is steadfast at limiting those kinds of threats. In order to monitor society, it does so in a couple ways. One is by what's referred to as a party cell, where you create organizations of party members where they work, where they live, to monitor what goes on in those places, but also to provide information and education to those party members about what current policy is and what's expected of them. That's kind of the old-fashioned way of keeping tabs on things. Nowadays, technology also plays an important role. So both facial recognition software, cell phone apps, censorship online, different ways of using technology that combined with these party organizations throughout society provides tremendous monitoring capacity. It provides oversight over the government. So the party largely decides what the policies will be. It is the government that carries them out, and the party oversees to make sure the government is not a source of opposition, but is loyally implementing the party's policies. Most government officials, anyone in a position of authority, is a member of the Communist Party. Another key way of providing oversight, that's true not just for the government, but in banks, in universities, in newspapers, in enterprises, especially state-owned enterprises. Anyone in a key position is most likely a party member. The party is the leading authority at any level. So in cities, the party secretary outranks the mayor at provincial level. The party secretary outranks the governor and so on. Within banks or universities, the president is often the public face of that organization, but the party secretary, if it's a different person, is really the inside authority on what goes on. So in these different ways, the party is supreme across much of the official state and even economic areas. This was really captured by President Xi Jinping back in 2017 at his opening speech to the 19th Party Congress, where he said, government, military, society, and schools, north, south, east, and west, the party leads it all, which sounds a little bit like hubris, but in fact, that's sort of what the party's ambition has been, especially under Xi Jinping, as I'll talk about in more detail throughout the talk here. Now, in explaining how it is that the party leads it all, most explanations begin with the idea that it uses repression to deal with threats that it sees coming from within society. That the party is repressive should come as no surprise to this group. We often read about the heavy-handed tactics against Uyghurs in Xinjiang, about the repression of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, the frequent arrest of dissidents and critics of the party, the heavy-handed censorship online, and all these different ways it uses to try and make sure that there's no challenge to its authority emanating from within the country. And it uses different types of repression. So hard repression is the most familiar one, arresting critics, putting them in prison. For some people, they're under house arrest even when they are out of prison. But this is probably the more familiar aspect where we often read about in the media, the camps that people have been put into in Xinjiang, reports of over 1 million people in total in these different camps. A key example of this hard repression. The crackdown in Hong Kong, similarly, an example of that. But the party uses other tools also to try and repressed society, or at least threats to it coming from within society. One of them is a euphemism referred to as being invited for tea, which is not as polite as it sounds. The police or the Public Security Bureau will call you in for an interview to find out what you're up to. Both individuals, leaders of non-governmental organizations, church leaders, and so on, are often invited for tea as a sort of an intimidation tactic. There's also what's referred to as relational repression, where instead of having the party or the government or the police directly try and put pressure on people, they get their family and friends to encourage them to back down if they're criticizing, if they're protesting, have family members especially, or close friends, or their boss at work try and intervene to persuade them to change what they're doing. Technology is certainly an example of this kind of softer style repression, not directly targeting people, but whether it's using the monitoring devices on cell phones, censorship online, different ways of managing information that flows between people and basically the party has some knowledge of what's going on there. There's the party, just somebody doesn't crack down on protests, it often tries to preempt protests from happening. So there's key events each year that lead to preemptive repression. The June 4th anniversary, the anniversary of the 1989 imposition of martial law in Tiananmen Square, the spring meetings of the National People's Congress, international events like a major diplomatic function, the Olympic Games back in 2008, the upcoming Winter Games, are all times of preemptive repressions. They try to prevent things from happening that might be embarrassing to the party or the government. So these repressive aspects are fairly well known, covered widely in the media, criticized by people inside and outside of China. But how do we explain the fact that this is a political system that so often uses repression, but is often responsive to public opinion in a variety of ways? This aspect of being responsive is not as well known. And so to kind of illustrate this responsive nature, even though it's not accountable to the public in the form of national elections, it's not how leaders are chosen, but it's often responsive in different ways. And I'll give a couple of examples of this. The book begins with a vignette from a village on the southeast coast of China. Back in 2011, the people of Wukong Village mobilized and protested against their leaders who had sold their land to developers to build a new industrial complex. And the villagers were complaining that they had not gotten adequate compensation for the loss of their farmland, which is their livelihood. So they first began protests in the village. They then moved on to the neighboring city where they marched on the government headquarters looking for a response from the government. The city leaders did not respond the way the protesters hoped. They sent police in to lock down the village. Over the course of several months, there's a standoff between protesters and the police. Several protesters were taken into custody. One of them died while in prison. The official story was that he died of a heart attack, but his family members said there were signs of torture that probably was more the direct cause of his death. Now, situations like this are common in China, where leaders ignore the rightful demands of the people, punish those who push for change, push for compensation, and who dare to push back against the party and government's actions. So this is a fairly common event, but then something very unusual happened. The provincial leader, provincial party secretary intervened, agreed to investigate their complaints, fired the village leaders, allowed new elections to be held, and one of the leaders of the protest movement became the elected new village leader. And here's a photo of the actual election box that was used for this new election. So the protest had the resolution that the villagers had originally hoped for. They got more compensation. They were able to elect a new leader. But so often the case in Chinese politics, there's more to this story than simply what meets the eye here. On the one hand, the person who was elected the village leader, even though he's a protest leader, was also a party member, as was the person who was fired from his job. So in that way, the party was simply reestablishing its authority over the village, replacing one party member with a new party member. He'd been approved by the provincial party committee in advance. So in that sense, the outcome was already known and approved. The protest did not spread to other villages because the party imposed sort of a blackout where the media couldn't cover the story. Villagers were warned not to talk to foreign media about it. So what looked to be a pro-democratic triumph was really just the party reestablishing its authority. But the story doesn't end there. A few years later, the newly elected village leader, who had been a protest leader to begin with, himself was arrested and charged with corruption. Was this the local officials eventually retaliating against him for leading the protest to begin with? Several years had gone by. The provincial leader had been promoted to Beijing, was no longer nearby to watch what was going on. So this may have been a retaliation for his protest to begin with. Or it may have been an example of someone who, once they got into office, became tempted by corruption as well and ended up being no better than the person that he replaced. It's kind of hard to know which of these is the correct story because this media blackout continued for years afterwards. So it's sort of a nice example of, on the one hand, responsiveness to public opinion, but in ways that serve the party's interest. So this episode illustrates some of the themes that are familiar to people who follow contemporary China closely. The imperative from the party to promote economic growth, which leads to examples of this where land is taken from farmers, taken from urban residents in residential areas, and reconverted into industrial or commercial projects. The land is sold for less than it's worth as the industrial and commercial project, and the difference between what is paid to the farmers or the urban residents and what it is sold to the developers gets pocketed by local officials, and this proves to be a very unpopular practice and leads to frequent tensions between the party and the people. With stability as another key priority, local officials are often, or higher level officials are tacit allies with protesters against the local people in between. So in these different examples, and I'll give you a few more in a sec, the party seems to be responsive to public opinion as long as its political interests are not directly affected. And these protests were by no means the only example. In policymaking, when there's issues of party priorities at stake, it's a very black box of decision making, very difficult to know what is being discussed behind closed doors. But on other types of issues, the party now encourages and even requires public input on laws and regulations before they get adopted, much like the public comment process in the United States on very popular issues like labor contracts or healthcare policy. There may be tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of comments that could submitted by everyday citizens, by stakeholders on the healthcare issue, by medical schools, by hospitals, by consulting firms. So much the way that interest groups lobby the government through the public comment period in the United States, a similar process happens within China. On more arcane issues like tort law or agricultural innovation, much less interest in those issues and much fewer comments. Other studies have shown that the higher the number of public comments that get submitted about laws and regulations, the less likely it is that there will be a protest when the law or regulation actually gets adopted. Because people feel, even if they're not happy with what gets adopted, they've had a choice, a chance to voice their opinion and appreciate the fact that they can be heard, even if they don't determine the final outcome. In its policies of rapid economic development have led to terrible problems of air pollution. This photo on the slide here shows two pictures taken from the same window in Beijing, one on a relatively clear day on the left, the other one on during the so-called airpocalypse of 2013, when the smog was so thick, the city, the airport was closed for almost a week. Just a tremendous common deterioration of air quality, in part because of the rapid economic growth in the country. Since then, the party has responded to both the international criticism of its environmental issues and the public distaste for those problems. They're recognizing the health consequences that come from breathing this kind of dirty air all the time. In 2016, 16 of the 20 cities around the world with the worst air pollution were in China. By 2019, only 4 of them were, in part because China cleaned up its air, in part because countries like India began having worse and worse air pollution. The fact that it's cleaned up its air in this sense, in terms of smog, just has not solved its economic problems. A report that came out a week or so ago found that China contributed 27% of the world's greenhouse gases back in 2019, the most recent year that information is available. Put it differently, China contributed more greenhouse gases than the other OECD countries, the advanced industrialized countries put together. So it still has a long ways to go before finally resolving its environmental problems, but it has been responding to public opinion on this. It has also been responding to what are called NIMBY, not in my backyard protests, about dams, about petrochemical plants, about high-speed rail systems. The photo on the left is a protest against the building of a PX plant. PX is a very flammable, very toxic chemical used in plastics and polyester fabric. When inhaled or rubbed on the skin, it can have severe health consequences. There are multiple protests against these planned PX factories over the past 5 or 6 years. In every case, local officials agreed to either cancel the plan or to move them to a less populated area. The photo on the right, you can see the little boy holding a sign saying no maglev. This is in Shanghai, where there are plans to build a high-speed rail, a magnetic levitation or maglev train from downtown Shanghai out to the, at that time, the relatively new Pudong airport. But it's going to go through residential areas and damage the quality of life there, fear that it would ruin property values. And so there's a large-scale ongoing protests, and eventually it got abandoned. It often will punish the leaders of these protests. So increasingly, they're sort of loosely organized events that don't have discernible leaders. But the party also pays compensation for people who have been damaged in different ways by by the party, by its policies. Now, one way of sort of looking at this ebb and flow over time is how the party has dealt with civil society. Now, some will say that China doesn't have a civil society. And if by civil society, you think of groups that are sort of have pro-democratic agendas trying to promote political change, then in that sense, there is no civil society in China. But in this country, we think of civil society groups as often local nonprofits, non-governmental organizations that are organized for social, welfare, cultural events. And China has got lots and lots of those. There's about 800,000 registered NGOs in China, about twice that many unregistered but active NGOs in the country. That they're unregistered, and so they're sort of an illegal gray area, but often work closely with local governments to provide key types of goods and services that I'll explain in just a sec. Its approach to civil society has changed over time. In the 1990s, the goal was to constrain civil society. This was right after the 1989 demonstrations in Beijing and elsewhere in the country, right after the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, and especially Eastern Europe, where it was thought that civil society groups in those countries helped bring about the downfall of communist governments. So even though the party under Jiang Zemin was rapidly promoting economic development, it was also trying to constrain civil society because it was worried of it being a threat to the party's existence. That changed when Hu Jintao became general secretary in 2002. The party at that point changed its goal from simply promoting rapid economic development to try and create a better distribution of the benefits of rapid economic growth to wider groups of people in the country. And there's a recognition at this point that NGOs provided useful services that the party and government often couldn't do on its own. So it began experimenting with having local officials sign contracts with NGOs to provide different types of services. So environmental NGOs would be hired to do a recycling campaign or an anti-litter campaign to monitor the pollution coming from state-owned enterprises, the air pollution, the water pollution, because they had people who could monitor that more effectively than often the understaffed government offices. They would sign contracts with labor NGOs to provide job training, life skills training, healthcare information, provide cultural and entertainment events to keep often migrant workers who were new to the cities, to give them something to do in their spare time. So in these different ways, trying to take advantage or benefit from what these civil society groups were doing. But there are also limits on what the NGOs can do. The leaders of them were often invited for tea to make sure that what they were doing was on the up and up. The contracts were often for a short time, so that if they were doing things that the party or government officials didn't like, they could be canceled. And because these NGOs were so dependent on these contracts, they often had to change what they did or limit what they did to make sure they kept the support of local officials. They might, instead of trying to promote collective bargaining, if they're a labor union, for example, they would focus on job training. For environmental organizations, they would focus on recycling and monitoring, but not try and change policy to make the standards of the environmental standards higher in the country. So in different ways, trying to cooperate, but also to keep some control over the range of activities that they were involved in. Once Xi Jinping becomes general secretary in 2012, the party shifts towards now trying to crack down on NGOs, even the ones that have been cooperating with local governments. Xi Jinping wants all types of activities to filter through formal party channels, not is less tolerant of the kind of the informal arrangements that had been happening at the local levels that had allowed the unregistered NGOs to flourish. In addition to shutting down NGOs, there's been a renewed push just this month at shutting down both registered and especially unregistered NGOs. The party now uses one of its more old-fashioned practices of building party organizations. So now NGOs are required to have a party organization within them. In 2012, only about 35% of NGOs had party organizations in them. By 2017, over 60%. So this was a 2/3 increase in just the first 5 years that she was party secretary. The recent demands to abolish the various unregistered groups really puts local officials in a bind, because they've been dependent so much, relying so much, and benefiting so much from these NGOs that it's hard to simply shut them down. At the same time, they have to show that they're loyal to Xi's new policies. So in some places, it's likely that local officials are going to slow walk the implementation of this new policy, or crack down on some, but quietly find ways of continuing to cooperate with others. So why is it in a political system where the leaders are not accountable to voters, why would they be responsive to public opinion? And there's a couple of key ways, all having to do with the party's strategy for staying in power. First of all, maintaining stability is a key goal of the party and a key requirement for local officials. If protests, if strikes break out on their watch, they could get fired from their position. Their chance of being promoted would be jeopardized. So instead of simply cracking down on the protests, they're often willing to use the funds set aside for police and public security, like in this photo, and use that money to pay settlements to people like the villagers in Wukong that I talked about earlier. People, if you're working for a factory that is closed down, you were promised a severance package but never got it, they might pay some portion of that severance package. If workers have not been paid for months at a time, they might be willing to provide money to compensate for those unpaid wages. So they're often willing to do things to address the demands of protesters rather than have them fester and even escalate. Second of all, the party wants to avoid a nationwide movement as occurred in 1989. This photo here is from Tiananmen Square during the height of the protests at that time. There are similar grievances about land grabs, about pollution, about working conditions that exist throughout the country. And there's a concern that if a protest is successful one place, it could snowball and spread elsewhere. And so there's a desire to prevent that from happening, to address the demands, partially by repressing and arresting the leaders of protests, but also addressing the material demands of the protests that are seen as legitimate. So better to be responsive to public opinion rather than endanger a nationwide protest movement that almost brought the party down back in 1989. And finally, the party wants to avoid a democracy movement in the country. So the image on the right in the upper corner refers to Charter 08, which was a online document that was posted in December 2008 by a group of prominent Chinese dissidents, one of whom is in the picture at the bottom, posted online in December 2008, calling for democratic reforms, very ambitious political reforms, which would really be undoing the political system and undoing the party's monopoly on power. Liu Xiaobo there on the bottom was arrested soon after this document was posted online. He was later sentenced to a lengthy jail term. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, but he was in prison at the time and obviously could not go receive it. He died in 2017, shortly after being released from prison on medical parole. But this episode was the last real public episode because the party cracked down so hard and so visibly on it. In short, there are incentives for party and government officials to be responsive to public opinion, but under Xi Jinping, there's been greater reliance on repression and not responsiveness. And how has that been shown? First of all, the party now will treat protests that used to be seen as simply that, protests, but now seen as criminal activity. Back in 2015, there was a group of 300 lawyers and their legal staff that were arrested almost simultaneously overnight. These were lawyers that would fight for the rights that were already guaranteed by Chinese law and by the Chinese constitution, the rights of workers, the rights of religious practitioners, but they were often a thorn in the side of the party. And so to send a signal that their activities would no longer be tolerated, more than 300 were arrested at once. Most were later released from prison, but there were several who received 3, 4, 5-year jail sentences as a warning to others to not cross the party. Second of all, the parties relied more now on preemptive repression. In 2019, there was an attempt to create a Me Too movement in China that was immediately repressed before it could really get underway. There were a few accusations against media, like news anchors and other celebrities, against some university professors, but the party shut it down very quickly before it was able to spread, in large part by censoring online discussion related to the Me Too movement in the country. The year before, in 2018, a group called the Feminist Five, who wanted to publicize sexual harassment in the country, were arrested and charged with illegal assembly, even though they hadn't even begun their protests. They were trying to organize one, but it never got off the ground because the party preemptively moved in and arrested the key leaders. Their mission about fighting sexual harassment and promoting women's equality was very much in line with the party's ideology, but they did two things that kind of crossed the red line of Chinese politics. One, this is a bottom-up movement that was done without the party's permission. And second of all, they're trying to organize their activities across different cities simultaneously. And that effort to try and organize these types of events is seen by the party as a real concern for it, and is not tolerated, especially under Xi Jinping. Third, in addition to viewing protest as criminal activities, in some cases it treats them as national security threats. In 2013, soon after Xi Jinping had become General Secretary of the party's leader, the party released secretly a document that came known as Document 9, which banned 7 so-called malicious Western values, including constitutional democracy and civil society, banned them from being discussed in schools or being mentioned in the media. International NGOs, which used to be able to operate without being registered in the country, now had to register. And whereas domestic NGOs would register with the Ministry of Civil Affairs, the foreign NGOs had to register with the Public Security Bureau. So they were being treated as a national security threat, not as organizations that were providing benefits to the country. Now, in the past, these types of ideas and organizations were characterized as threats to stability, but now they were seen as threats to international security because they were foreign influences, foreign ideas that were being brought in to undermine not just the party, but undermine the China as a nation. And given the very strong nationalist sentiments in China, any group, any individual who's framed as being unpatriotic will lose any type of support they might be able to have. So to wrap this up, the CCP has remained as China's ruling party for over 70 years because it was built on Leninist principles, selective membership, oversight of the government, monopoly and political organization, and continues to abide by those principles. There's no question the party uses repression as a way of dealing with its perceived enemies, but also uses other tools to create popular support for itself, economic development, now nationalism, responsiveness to public opinion in different ways. For people whose views of the Chinese political system and the party in particular are shaped by the Cultural Revolution or by the '89 demonstrations, by criticism of political leaders more recently, by reports in the media, this notion that the party is both repressive and responsive may come as a kind of a jarring idea. So it's my hope that readers of this book will come away with a fuller understanding of China's political system, how it's arrived at this point, and where it may be going. So with that, I will end my presentation and look forward to your questions.
Yeah, let me unmute myself. That might be helpful. Feel free to enter your questions. Like I said, there's the QA button on the bottom there. I don't see any open questions at the moment. I'll kick things off with a question. So is there a chance that the crackdown in Hong Kong will change the CCP at all? Is it the same repressive tactics they've used in the past? What influence, if any, might there be from what's happened in Hong Kong on the CCP?
It's probably more accurate to say the impact on the party is really coming from the international audience. There's been almost universal international criticism of its recent embrace and squeezing of Hong Kong, the arrest of the pro-democracy activists, changing of the law to make it no longer a separate entity with its own laws. It's now folded into the Chinese political system more completely. Within China, it is not likely to have an impact on the party, in part because of the way in which Hong Kong is viewed by other people in China. And this is based more on sort of just casual conversations and anecdotes. But the people in Hong Kong are seen as being too westernized. They were a colony of Britain for 100 years, and the thought is that they are too oriented toward the West and not sufficiently to their Chinese heritage. When students from Hong Kong go abroad and talk about them as being that they're Hong Kong people, often criticized by other Chinese students for not recognizing their Chinese identity. They're predominantly Cantonese speakers, different from the Mandarin speakers elsewhere in the country. Already seen as having more rights and privileges that are available elsewhere in China. So there's not much sympathy for the people in Hong Kong by people within China. I think it has revealed the limits of what the party is willing to do, revealed it very much to the international audience, and came as a big surprise to people in Hong Kong. But I don't think it came as much of a surprise to other people in China, and probably didn't come as much of a concern for them either, because they didn't look to Hong Kong as a potential future for themselves. There's a little bit of I don't want to say envy, but sort of recognition that they already had so good. What are they complaining about? So there's not a lot of sympathy for Hong Kong elsewhere in China.
Okay, looks like we have a question here. Question comes from Liang. Why do you think under Xi the party becomes more repressive? Is it just Xi's personal influences or some sort of structural underlying factors? Are there any forces you see that could change or weaken Xi's regime from within the party, within China, or outside?
Boy, that is
That's
deep
a
question.
deep question. It's a great question, a
It's a great
series of questions.
and one that I've really been wrestling with. It could be a couple of factors. One, it could be that the Xi and other party leaders know things that are not visible to outside observers because they had been dealing with the impact of economic development in the country, about being more responsive to protests in different ways. This more reliance upon on really hard repression seems over the top and unnecessary. So there may be something they know that we don't know. It may be there's simply risk-averse people, and Xi Jinping seems, from all we can tell from all of his statements, a very risk-averse kind of people. It could also be true that they're making a big blunder, that things are not as bad as they are making them seem or reacting to. There's a danger when you use repression too much, you begin pinching people that pose no threat to you. And then the people that might be supportive because of rising living standards and new opportunities, but now you're impacting their lives in the way that you had not in recent memory. And now you get resentment when there was no reason to do that. So there's different reasons that may be at play. And it's hard to know exactly. One of the key things about Chinese politics in recent years, really since 1989, we don't know very much about the internal discussions and debates among Chinese leaders about what the lines of debate are. Does Xi really face no opposition from within the top of the party? It's kind of hard to imagine, given his consolidation of power, the elimination of term limits on his ability to remain as president for as long as he wants. There had been a very orderly, regular rotation of leaders at the top of the political system that Xi has just upended, seemingly with no opposition whatsoever. Surely it has to be people within the party, within the government, within the military, who recognize the benefits of this peaceful, regular change of leaders. There have been reports about factional differences or opposition to Xi coming from within the party and from within the military. And one explanation for the anti-corruption campaign that he launched immediately on becoming Chinese president was to eliminate his political rivals, as well as dealing with the corruption at the local level, which was a huge issue. But he was targeting people at the very top of the system that may have posed a threat to him. So he may have been addressing that concern that way. So at this point, it's not clear that he has much of an opposition within the party at the very top. It's not clear who his successor will be, should he ever resign or be unable because he dies of a heart attack or something dramatic happens. It's not clear who would take over. In the past, we always knew who the next leader would be because it was very publicly telegraphed. So in different ways, Xi is both using sort of repressive tactics against society, against real or imagined threats there, and centralizing power in himself in ways that usually end up as creating instability in political systems. Might be good for Xi himself, but may be bad for the party as a whole.
Okay, the next question comes from Gabriel Z. What do you think of the danger of the invasion of Taiwan? Many observers suggested that China will take action once the cost is tolerable.
A similar reaction as to the question about Hong Kong. I have not met anyone in China who does not think that Taiwan is part of China. and is willing to tolerate either an indefinite separation, a de facto independent Taiwan, or a formal declaration of independence there. So there's wide scale support within the country for eventually reunifying Taiwan with the mainland. At the same time, there's no appetite for that within Taiwan. So the only solution would be force of some kind, whether a direct attack or just a blockade of some kind, or just pressure to be convince Taiwan's leaders to either agree to terms or to, surrender. The key here is whether or not the U.S. and other countries are really going to be willing to defend Taiwan if China does attack. The official policy is to not say one way or the other. It won't say it'll defend Taiwan because that might embolden Taiwan's leaders to be more independent-minded. It won't say it won't defend Taiwan because it may embolden China to act more aggressively towards Taiwan. So it's a policy that really satisfies neither Taiwan or China in that regard, but it's also seen as has worked for these many decades, and the ambiguity may be necessary to sustain it. But now that China's military is getting stronger, the American military is farther away to be able to respond to any attack that China would launch. The situation is looking more and more dicey from the standpoint of Taiwan's situation. Is one of the issues that I know from people who work in the State Department, the Pentagon, occupies so much of their time is a conflict over Taiwan and what the proper policy of the U.S. should be towards Taiwan, as well as what would happen if different scenarios played out. So it is a huge issue going forward. And I will say, again, like Hong Kong, there's not much sympathy within China for Taiwan. You might think it's a democratically elected government there, has been that way for a couple of decades. Wouldn't the people in China like a similar political system? They don't really see it that way. They look at Taiwan as sort of kind of interesting, but not really a role model that they see for themselves. More like a curiosity than an actual example for them to emulate.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Next one looks like it comes from Joanne. Comment on any crackdown on family members who trained in the US but are currently in the US working. Are they being harassed? I was in China with a medical NGO. The NGO has been clamped down on to significant challenge.
Yeah, this is an example of what I mentioned, relational repression, where people who are abroad who might be critical are their relatives back in China, or often take the heat for it to try and put pressure on the people who've left China. And what impact that has, it's sort of more a quieter effort. So exactly what impact it has, it hasn't really been covered very much. I've seen much more reporting about the use of these tactics against Uyghurs who are now living in the US or elsewhere, who have been very vocal and critical about the party's policies in Xinjiang, but less so for other types of professionals. There has been an ambitious effort from the party to try and encourage the many Chinese students who went abroad for education to return to China, to bring those skills back to China. And some are willing to go because they're very patriotic and want to return home. Some see the increased repression in the country and want to wait and see how things play out. So it's, in some ways, this extra use of repression may be very short-sighted, because it will deter people from returning home. It will deter international NGOs from operating within China because it's just too dangerous or too difficult. All the expats I knew who were working on financial matters, that were sort of monitoring bank policy, monitoring the stock market, and so on, they've all left the country because they just found between the air pollution and the growing crackdown, the increased censorship, it was just no longer viable to work in China. So it may be very short-sighted. You eliminate certain threats, but you also deprive yourselves of other kinds of benefits.
And we'll have one more question. This one comes from Daniel. Are Americans who visit China or work in China at risk of arrest and imprisonment for discussing democratic reform with Chinese citizens?
I have not heard of those cases. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen or wouldn't happen. I know it's been more and more difficult for scholars like me to visit China. Not so much that we're not able to go, but it's a concern that as you visit your friends and colleagues the way you normally would, you may be putting them in jeopardy. So they'll get invited to tea to find out who were they talking to, what were they talking about. And there's often reluctance to put your friends and colleagues in danger in that way. There have been cases of citizens from other countries, especially the two Canadians, who remain in prison, were recently formally sentenced. There have been Chinese Americans or people who were from China that then gained US citizenship that have been prevented from leaving the country. But so far there have not been, that I'm aware of at least, not direct examples of non-Chinese American citizens who were arrested for those types of political activities. Most Americans are careful about doing that, but being careful isn't always enough.
Yeah, when I was studying in Beijing in the mid-90s, this kind of relates to what the question. There was a couple of British students at my school who, for some reason, decided to sell pro-democracy T-shirts at Tiananmen Square, and they were promptly expelled from school, and we didn't speak much of it after that. So I know of things like that happening for sure.
There are times that often seem things have changed, things are open, you can do things now that you couldn't do before, and then things go back to how they were before, and then what you were doing, which was okay previously, now you're in trouble.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure having you this evening, Bruce. Thank you so much for joining us. And everyone, just a reminder, Bruce's book, The Party and the People, is available on Amazon.com or Powell's Books. Powell's is a big books retailer out here in Portland, and they have an online presence as well. So, or your local bookstore. So it's a pleasure having you this evening. And just a reminder to everyone, we're going to take about a 5-minute break, and then there's a link in chat here for our social. I don't want to call it an hour because we're not going to meet for an hour, but there's a socialization period that you're welcome to join. And I'm going to take a quick break, and we'll see you there in about 5 minutes. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's great to be here.
Mm-hmm.